Climate change's impact on infectious disease. When researching the impact of the rising climate and the spread of infectious disease, a few pathogens have been focused in on more than others. For example, cholera, which stems from the bacteria Vibrio, has been heavily researched because more people across the world have been impacted by it. Cholera is caused from drinking contaminated water, and as the temperature and humidity rise, there is an increase in precipitation as well. This then directly contaminates drinking water across the globe. This rainfall explains why water sources are being more contaminated and the rise in cholera cases have been seen globally. Additionally, chytrid, a pathogen found in fungi, has been studied more because it has begun flourishing in hotter climates when it should be growing best in cooler ones. This change is leading scientists to believe that pathogens are adapting to warmer climates and developing resistance to cooler ones. By studying these pathogens, researchers have seen that there is a direct correlation between temperature and infectious disease. The rise in infectious agents is partially due to host cells having decreased immunity and resistance, and the pathogens never tapering off in the winter months. In years past, countries have relied on harsh winters to help stop the spread of infectious disease because the pathogens would go into a state of hibernation during the winter. However, now with mild winters, pathogens are prevalent year-round. The relationship between the host and the pathogen is a parasitism relationship, as the pathogen needs the host in order to survive, but the host cell is being harmed in the process. Due to the negative relationship between the two, the rise in infectious disease is very alarming. This rise is directly correlated to the rising temperature and increased transmission rates of infectious agents. This in turn has sparked fear within the community as regions have begun seeing pathogens they have never seen before as the world's climate is gradually getting warmer and warmer.
Alright, so I'm talking about ecophysiology of host-pathogen interactions, and a big component of this is the metabolic theory of ecology. So the metabolic theory of ecology uses different relationships between three statistics of the body. The MTE uses metabolic rate, body size, and body temperature to predict host pathogen interactions. MTE is based off the idea that these connections found with these three statistics have the greatest impact on processes within the body. And so a good study I found was about fungus that affected coral. And so with an increase in temperature, not only did the fungus become more dangerous, but the coral's defense was weakened. And so this theory is important because with this theory, scientists no longer have the need for species-specific knowledge, which can make the process of working and studying these host pathogen interactions much simpler, and they can generalize much better.
So I'm going to be talking about how climate change affects community ecology. The definition of ecology is the study of interactions between biotic and abiotic organisms. Climate change causes interactions between organisms and their environments to change when said environments are changed or affected by climate change. Because of this, endemic pathogens or organisms are forced to change behaviors. For example, pathogens infect species outside of ordinary infection, or there's even the risk of extinction for host species due to climate change. Loss of a particular species, specifically a keystone species, creates drastic ripple effects on subsequent species within a given food web. An example of a keystone species and how they create an ecological impact would be the gray wolf. The gray wolf was absent from Yellowstone National Park for many years, and as a result, many other species of plants and animals suffered. The herbivores, elk, consumed too much plant life since there were no predators to hunt them, and plant life suffered drastically. They were recently introduced and controlled the population of deer. Another example would be prairie dogs. Prairie dogs affect plant life through their burrowing in their respective areas. Their burrowing helps to turn over soil by changing the soil chemistry, increasing permeation of water into soil, and allow for organic materials to enter the soil more effectively, which affects plants. They also affect nitrogen levels in the soil, which help to stabilize the amount of prey for predators.
Elevated temperatures as a result of climate change lead to less competition between two types of microbes: commensal microbes, which take up resources from a given host and can potentially lead to disease, and mutualistic microbes, in which both the host and the microbe benefit. So there's less competition because certain microbes cannot withstand elevated temperatures or they can't withstand certain conditions that change, and this leads to less diversity and an increase in transmission rates. And this affects other animals in a given food web. An example from the article includes the seagrass, which was infected by the Protus labyrinthia zosterae, which not only caused a decrease in the amount of seagrass in a given ecosystem, but affected fish and birds that use the seagrass for nurseries, according to Altizer. So, biodiversity loss can affect how the remaining species that survive will behave, and in this case of pathogens, remaining pathogens don't have as much competition as stated earlier. The dilution effect describes how higher biodiversity equals lower infection rates by pathogens, and subsequently how lower biodiversity leads to higher infection rates, and this can also have an effect on the interactions between other species in a negative way.
Hello. Phenology is defined as interactions between organisms and sometimes in relation to their climate. Milder winters, for example, have allowed organisms such as butterflies that typically migrate to reside in their home breeding grounds instead. This increases the amount of organisms that would otherwise miss widespread parasite infections that typically occur during their normal winter migration. Furthermore, there are parasites who capitalize on changing climates to reproduce, and as a result of climate change, will bloom earlier in warming climates. The combination of these two pattern changes will overall increase infection rates and can detrimentally affect entire ecosystems. Changes in wild health and patterns can compromise the livelihoods of indigenous populations who depend on key organisms to survive. For example, the indigenous population in Alaska depend on caribou, but these caribou are acceptable to parasites that also have this plastic effect to them and will allow them to bloom earlier in warming climates. Moreover, organisms such as Costovibril increase with algae blooms / tepid conditions and are responsible for millions of human infections in the undeveloped regions of the world. Algae blooms also occur more frequently in correlation with climate warming. With better forecasting and model predictions, infrastructure and proper public health policies can be best implemented in key areas where the most harm is theorized to occur. Additionally, in doing so, marginalized communities of developing regions become less disenfranchised.
Alright guys, I'm going to be continuing talking about the climate change and infectious diseases, building off the previous slide that showed the consequences for conservation and human health as a whole. I will be discussing the outlook and future challenges that we may face. Looking at the mechanistic models and drivers, the initial driver is the rate of temperature that is constantly changing throughout. The mechanistic models of the study shows the effects of many aspects, such as precipitation and humidity, because of the rising temperature. If you look at the climate risk across different systems, as humans increase their footprint, more ecosystems are at risk, such as the coral reef and the Arctic. An example of the risks that are illnesses appearing, such as chorea, which is normally gained from eating seafood that was undercooked. However, due to the rising temperatures, the illness is more frequent and appearing more. Moving on to climate disease interactions and their implications on other aspects of climate change, the climate disease interactions show that not only natural systems are affected and cause the problematic on the infectious diseases, it's also included in humans, as previously mentioned. While looking in the future, it's obvious that the environment is changing, which means it could cause those who depend on wildlife to be more at risk than others. And we will need to create or add onto existing mechanistic models to help those who are more vulnerable to have a better understanding, which improves detection from a local level and helps predictions on a global scale.